So I can talk
That's
now?
all I got.
Let's see. It's almost, 7:13. Okay. Well, some parts of this can get a little tricky, okay? I'm not going to rush my way through it as best I know how. And because I understand some of you, the last time you took a science class was like decades ago and that sort of thing. Maybe not was one of your favorite topics anyway. But theistic evolution, well, I show you a graphic over there about what is evolution. And that this describes it that evolution is the process of change over a long period of time. And you can see all kinds of critters up here. This is Darwin's Tree of Life, illustrated with actual organisms this time. And of course, here are some Galapagos finches, and here is the ubiquitous slide series of images for human evolution. But theistic evolutionists are Bible-believing Christians who are convinced by the scientific evidence for evolution that they are therefore convinced that God used evolution as his means to create. And that every aspect of what we would call naturalistic evolution is the way things happen. Now, some might say that God may have caused the various mutations that were needed, but you can never discover that. There's no way of finding that, discovering that actual imprint. That's an unnecessary addition, but it's what some people try to explain how God might have been involved. Well, as Kirby pointed out, this is the book. I'm going to summarize this 900 plus page book in about 40 minutes. They're laughing, Sue. I don't know. Okay. Well, you can see up here that editors J.P. Moreland, Stephen C. Meyer, Christopher Shaw, Ann Gager, and Wayne Grudem. So we're going to open with the scientific critique has two parts to it. And so over the last year or so, I've written 4 different radio programs for Probe Ministries about this book. And so 2 scientific sections and then a philosophical one and a theological section. Well, here's the 2 scientific parts. First, part 1, they called the failure of neo-Darwinism, and I'll discuss what that is. And basically, it's the process of evolution that it just doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And the second part was the case against a universal common ancestry and for a unique human origin. Now, I'm going to cover human origins in just one slide later on here, but let me go back. What you see here, this is common ancestry. Everything is descended from this one initial. Some of them actually say that God created the first life. They don't believe it happened chemically, but from that, evolution took over. So everything else came about through evolution except maybe for the very first life. So you see the origin of life even on this diagram, and then you have all different kinds of animals and plants come up. By the way, I was going to mention this. This is the only room that plants occupy. I don't think most botanists would be happy with that. I think they'd want that to be a little bit fuller portion of the tree of life. Anyway, so the question, what is neo-Darwinism? Well, you have to understand, first of all, that Darwin didn't know anything about DNA. All he suggests was that nature selected from variations. Now, what caused those variations or what they were due to, Darwin had no idea. But then, in the 20s to the 50s, scientists suggest that the variations came from DNA mutations. So the DNA mutations are what is the cause of new proteins, new structures eventually. And this eventually led to what is called the central dogma of evolutionary biology. Now, it goes something like this. I'm not going to go through much elaboration here, but Proteins are made through a process called protein synthesis, and that starts with the DNA. The DNA contains the code to make proteins. Well, the DNA is transcribed into RNA, and then that RNA is taken out into the cytoplasm where it's made into protein at the ribosomes. So the central dogma has been DNA makes RNA, makes protein, makes us. Essentially, it's trying to say that everything about us is controlled by the information in DNA. That's been what's been called the central dogma of evolutionary biology. Questions? Good so far? Okay. But is DNA sufficient to construct an organism? Well, what I'm going to show you here is that DNA does not fully specify many RNAs. What you see here at the top, now that's a molecule of DNA. And you notice there's something written here, exon 1, exon 2, exon 3, exon 4, and exon 5. Well, that DNA gets transcribed into RNA that has those same exons on it and all that intervening sequences. But then the exons are cut out, and they are spliced together. Now, this protein has exon 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But many times, it only has 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Doesn't use exon 3. Or here, the next one, you can have exons 1, 2, 3, and 5, no 4. There is a gene in Drosophila fruit flies that can be alternatively spliced into 18,000 different proteins. So, as they used to say, one gene, one protein. Nobody says that anymore, because one gene can make many, many proteins. Hundreds, sometimes thousands. Okay, so now we see that DNA does not completely specify the RNA. The RNA gets put together does not always correspond to the DNA sequence. But then once you get a protein, these are modified after they are synthesized. This has nothing to do with information from the DNA. I show you here just a table of protein glycosylation. Glycans are basically links of carbohydrates, glucose molecules, sugar molecules stuck together, sometimes in branching patterns, sometimes in long chains. But why do they do that? Well, this aids in the proper protein folding. If a protein doesn't get folded properly, it can't do its job. And sometimes it needs these glycans in order to fold properly. Provides protection from being broken down by enzymes in the cell. And the glycans can be employed for signaling. Sometimes those contain construction about where the protein is supposed to go. And it says here, most soluble and membrane-bound proteins made in the I'll just say ER, are glycoproteins in contrast to cytoplasm proteins. So proteins being modified after they're synthesized, that has nothing to do with the information in the DNA molecule. So not only does the DNA not fully specify the RNA, but the RNA does not fully specify the end result of the protein. And this gets really fascinating for me. The cell contains spatial information. When you see a three-dimensional model of a cell, and you'll see different parts all throughout the animation, well, all of those parts have to be in that particular location. And all those different parts, or what are called organelles, have to be taken to those locations. Even the outer membrane of the protein, there are proteins embedded all throughout that membrane, and clusters of them have to be in one particular space with all those other proteins and no place else. Otherwise, things don't go right with the cell. So how does this happen? Well, some message RNAs contain sequences called zip codes that specify the address in the cell to which they are to be transported. Now, there therefore also needs to be an address in the cell to make sure they get to the right place. Now, that address in the cell has nothing to do with DNA. In cells with a nucleus, there are microtubules that act as highways that motor proteins use to transfer bundles within the cell. Bundles usually containing proteins that have to get to a particular location. And they need to arrive at the proper address. Now, I'm going to show you a video here of a motor protein, and it's going to be walking down a microtubule. And sometimes microtubules will crisscross, and the motor protein will make a left turn, make a right turn. It doesn't keep going straight. We have no idea how it knows to do that. How those motor proteins get that bundle to the proper place in the cell, we still don't have any idea. So here's what it looks like. I still am amazed every time I see an animation of that. I mean, those two club feet, when it lifts off, it needs a energy molecule of ATP to get it to move ahead and stick to the microtubule. And then the other one needs ATP to get up and club itself in front of that one. And it's looked like it's got these big arms like Atlas holding the world on his shoulders, you know. And again, how it knows to get where it's going, we don't really know. No. Now, within this problem, embryological development uses two different codes. One is called a sugar code, and the other is bioelectric fields they use to actually make the organism. So here come the glycans again. On the surface of cell membranes have been called the most information-dense molecules in nature. So they're telling you right here, there's information in these sugars that are on the cell membrane that doesn't come from the DNA. Cell surface glycans in early embryos of worms, fruit flies, fish, chicks, and mice change in a highly ordered manner, forming patterns corresponding to specific stages of development. Where does that information come from? How do those sugar codes get interpreted to make sure things go to the right place? Finally, the interior of a newly fertilized frog egg is negatively charged compared to the outside of the cell, somewhat positively charged. This creates an electric field. As the fertilized egg divides and its cells rearrange themselves to form a tadpole, the electric field changes in organized ways. What's controlling the organized changes of these electric fields? Clearly, again, it's not coming from the DNA. So we're able to see that, so as I like to say here, the central dogma in evolutionary biology completely fails. Nearly all proteins are modified after synthesis with glycan molecules that aid in their folding into the proper shape and their destination in the cell. Embryonic development uses a sugar code and bioelectric fields to build the organism. Therefore, DNA does not completely specify RNA. RNA does not completely specify a protein, and proteins do not specify us. It doesn't all come from the DNA. There's lots of other sources of information involved here. And again, but we're still trying to discover how all of that works. Where do those informational codes come from? What actually codes for those? How do they arise? And how is it that they're used? One last thing about this aspect of things. You may remember in the book of Job, when Job is taken on the carpet by God, one of the things he asks, is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? Job 39:27. Well, Doug Axe has a chapter in this first section of the Scientific Critique, and this is one of the evidences he uses, and he simply asks the question, can we make an eagle today? With all of our technologies, what can we come up with? Well, it doesn't come close. Yeah, flying toys with flappy wings don't even come close. They need assembly lines. All pieces have to be added together by humans. They eventually break down. Humans have to replace the parts that broke. And even more importantly, the flying toys we make cannot reproduce. The eagle, however, there is no raptor assembly line. The eagle self-assembles in the egg and learns from its parents how to be an eagle. No human assembly line is needed. It happens, and it's all been pre-programmed so that eagles fly, and they learn how to fly from parents, and they just, like I said, self-assemble inside that egg. So yeah, we're not going to be able to make anything we see in God's creation. We can't do it. We're not even able to synthesize the first cell. By the way, if you want some humorous entertainment, there is a organic synthetic chemist from Rice University, Dr. James Tour, T-O-U-R. You just type Dr. James Tour into YouTube, and you'll get various videos of him basically tearing apart any idea of how life could have arisen apart from just chemical processes. So, it only took about 20 minutes. Second part. How important is universal common ancestor to theistic evolutionists? Francis Collins said the conclusion of a common ancestor for humans and mice is virtually inescapable. Darrell Falk, another theistic evolutionist, virtually all geneticists are convinced that they, mammals, share a common ancestor. Dennis Venema said numerous independent lines of genomics evidence strongly support the hypothesis that our species shares a common ancestor with other primates. There is an organization named BioLogos that promotes theistic evolution. You might be surprised if you know who William Lane Craig is and Timothy Keller. They are both theistic evolutionists. So, scientific critique here. We have to ask about this idea of common ancestry. Are all organisms descended from a single original organism? Do we find in the fossil record evidence of transitional forms showing the gradual change between organisms? Well, here's one potential. Here's an example. The primitive 3 to 4 toed horse, or called Hyracotherium, to the 1-toed modern horse, you can see photographs, but you can see fossils lined up in an order that would seem to indicate that maybe there is an evolutionary linkage. There's a series of mammal-like reptiles that show how the backbones of the lower jaw of the reptile ended up being the bones in our inner ear. Maybe. Not very significant changes, however. But there are far more discontinuities where there are major transitions in the fossil record that there is absolutely no fossil evidence for. Now, what you see on the left is just, those are animals. There's about 10 phyla up there. You don't need to know their names necessarily, but you can see sponges on the far left. You see mammals on the far right. And you see starfish in between and flatworms and all sorts of things, arthropods. And these little lines that are drawn here give you the impression that we know who evolved from what. Well, there's something called the Cambrian explosion. It's the sudden appearance of nearly all animal phyla. Nearly all of these phyla suddenly appear in the Cambrian, which is said to be 540 or so million years ago. And all the phyla appear first. And then they start delineating various classes and orders and all sorts of things down from there. But the phyla appear first. And the phylum is the largest classification in the kingdom of animals. Each phylum has a unique body plan. And the fossil evidence doesn't show anything about where all these unique body plans came from. It doesn't demonstrate who's more related to who, or who came from who had a common ancestor. It doesn't tell us anything like that. There are no reliable ancestors in the Precambrian and no evidence of transitions between the phyla. A couple of other things I'll just mention here. All the orders of mammals and birds all appear within about, they say, 10 million years, no intermediates. So here you see on the left all the various orders of mammals. Well, they just kind of show up. There's no transitional forms. They're just there. Same thing with birds. They just show up. And again, how can you justify common ancestry when you find all of these extremely major discontinuities? And there are also some biogeography problems. Casey Luskin talks about this in his, which he calls a comprehensive critique of common ancestry. That's kind of how Casey operates. Well, New World monkeys are said to have arrived in South America, they say, about 30 million years ago. They have to be related to Old World monkeys in Africa by common descent. Well, the New World monkeys just didn't show up out of anywhere, just out of nowhere, okay? So there are some Old World monkeys in Africa that they believe they are related to. The question then becomes, how'd they get there? At this time of 30 million years ago, or a little bit before that, the South American continent and the African continent are about 1,500 miles apart. Where'd they come from? Well, ingenious method here. 2 monkeys or 1 pregnant female rafted across the southern Atlantic, a distance of at least 1,600 miles. Kon-Tiki, yes. In order to preserve common ancestors, you've got to come up with things like this. It just doesn't make any sense. And here are some of the Old World monkeys are on the left, and the one on the right is one of my favorites, a New World monkey called a capuchin. And many of the New World monkeys have what they call prehensile tails. They can wrap their tail around a tree branch and hang down, and they can use all of their limbs to do whatever they want. No Old World monkeys have prehensile tails. Only New World monkeys do. So I'm going to show you here how Casey Luskin summarizes his common ancestry. For these, which I've given you, and many other reasons, even some mainstream evolutionary scientists are becoming increasingly skeptical of universal common ancestry and the monophyly of life. Monophyly simply means coming from one origin. A 2009 paper in Trends in Genetics noted that breakdowns in core neo-Darwinian tenets, like the traditional concept of the tree of life, or that natural selection is the main driving force of evolution, indicate the modern synthesis has crumbled, apparently, beyond repair. Another paper in Biology Direct noted that the sudden emergence of new complex forms contradicts a tree pattern. Well, 21st century biology seems to be following the evidence beyond universal common ancestry and the neo-Darwinian tree of life. He simply suggests our friends in the theistic evolution community would be wise to follow suit. But again, most theistic evolutionists are completely convinced of neo-Darwinism, the mechanism, and of universal common ancestry. That's why they feel accepting evolution is necessary. Now, one thing here about humans. See, Australopithecus afarensis, then Homo habilis, then Homo erectus, and Homo neanderthalensis, then Homo sapiens. Well, there's no fossil evidence of a common ancestor between humans and chimps. We have no evidence of such a common ancestor. And there's no transitions from Australopithecines, you may have heard the term Lucy, and modern Homo, or Homo erectus, Homo sapiens. And Lucy, an Australopithecine, did not walk upright, as many textbooks have contended. So a lot of the evidence you've seen or heard about, especially in the media, don't trust anything you read in the media about evolution. Don't trust it. They will hop on any current, recent explosion of information. For instance, there was a fossil found that dated to 4 to 5 million years ago. It was called Arthropithecus ramidus, or Arthropithecus. And it was hailed at the moment as the true common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees. And media picked it up, and several other science journals picked it up. It was hailed. But when others started looking into it, they discovered that most of the bones, including almost all of the skeletal structure from the neck down, was completely crushed. And trying to put it back together was a bit of a challenge. And they said if you picked up one of the pieces, it would crumble. So you had to kind of imagine what that piece was and how it fit together into things. And for the most part now, Arthropithecus has been completely dropped from any pathway from chimps to humans. Now, philosophical critique. Now, this deals with the question of what is science? How do we determine what science is? And this is primarily a philosophical question. It's not really a scientific question. Over the last 150 years, science has been defined using a term called methodological naturalism. That's a mouthful. Obviously, methodological means it's a method, and naturalism means it's a natural method. So this principle asserts that to qualify as science, a theory must explain all phenomena by reference to purely physical or material, that is, not intelligent causes or processes. Or that methodological naturalism holds that the statements of science must invoke only natural things and processes. That wasn't how science has always been practiced. But as I said, over the last 150 years, that's what's happened. As one eminent theistic evolutionist put it, for better or worse, we've inherited a view of science as methodologically atheistic. That's what we've inherited. I guess if we've inherited it, then it must be true. Well, so methodological naturalism. Over the decades, a set of demarcation criteria have arose that separate science from all other endeavors of knowledge. Now, there's 3 of them. Scientific theories must be based on observable data and or must be testable or falsifiable, or must offer explanations based on natural law. If a theory fails at least one of these criteria, it is not science. Now, some of you are old enough to remember 1980s law in the state of Arkansas requiring creationism to be taught alongside evolution. Big trial ensued, the state was sued in federal court, and federal Judge William Overton ruled against this law in January 1982, using these demarcation criteria to rule that creationism is not science and could therefore not be taught in Arkansas public schools. Now, initially, most media outlets accepted that, made perfect sense to them. But it was interesting that philosophers of science had a very different view. Not that they agreed in the least with any form of creationism, but the decision was blistered by philosophers of science because these criteria would have eliminated Newton and Galileo's law of gravitational phenomena because they did not know what caused it. And they were quite open about that. Newton actually used various theological principles in developing his law of gravitation. Their equations accurately predicted gravitational events, but they had no idea how that worked. So they weren't appealing to natural law, so that can't be science. And as the philosopher of science said, nobody would want to accuse Newton and Galileo of that today. And also, similarly, Darwin, as I said earlier, knew nothing of genes and DNA on which his theory would eventually depend. But nobody would classify his views as being unscientific when he first published On the Origin of Species. So, we find that evolution and theology of creation are intertwined. Interestingly, Darwin contrasted his theory of natural selection with special creation and design repeatedly in The Origin of Species. His chief goal was to show that special creation was erroneous, not that it wasn't science. He used scientific evidence in his mind to demonstrate that special creation was wrong. And he used scientific evidence to do so, but if you use scientific evidence to demonstrate that special creation is erroneous, it is possible then to use scientific evidence to demonstrate that it's correct and therefore is science. You can't have it both ways. If it isn't science, then you can't use scientific evidence to prove that it's wrong. It's not science. Why bother? You can't do it. Now we come to the easiest part here, theological critique. So I'm going to ask the question here, do theistic evolutionists retain all conservative Christian doctrines? Emphatically, no, they do not. The first thing you have to realize is they will all readily admit that humans evolved from a population of at least 5,000 individuals. That contention alone has numerous difficult consequences. Well, therefore, there's no Adam and Eve. There's 5,000 humans at the start. Well, even if he designated two individuals as Adam and Eve, guess what? They had human parents. They had to have. Therefore, they're not really the first humans. God simply took two of that 5,000 and said, well, you're Adam, you're Eve. Now, this obviously contradicts Genesis, which has God creating Adam from the dust of the ground and Eve from Adam's rib. And interestingly, if you're going to say that Adam and Eve are not historical, then you've got a problem in another chapter of Genesis, Genesis 5. Well, this links to Adam's creation. Genesis 5 verse 1 says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them. He blessed them and named them man when they were created." Look at how many times he's saying create. When Adam lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Doesn't it sound like Scripture's talking about a real person? How old he was when he had Seth? How many years he lived after that? Let's see. 1, 2, 3. 3 times he uses the word created. At least, according to God, at least Adam was a real person. But not if you're a theistic evolutionist. Also, therefore, Adam and Eve were never sinless human beings. They were part of an evolving population who acted in their own self-interest as evolution of a species requires, which means they sinned. They probably took food from somebody else. They probably, stole somebody's home or whatever kind of hut they used, grabbed it from somebody else for themselves because it was better than what they made, and all sorts of things. They were all sinful from the very beginning. And also, human death did not arise with Adam and Eve. People were dying before they even existed, if they existed at all. You see the deep theological consequences of theistic evolution. Not all humans, therefore, also have descended from Adam and Eve, because there were thousands of other human beings, and they all interbred. So we're not the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. We're the sons and daughters of 5,000 human beings. They would say about 2 million years ago. Now, I forgot to say at the beginning, which my wife encouraged me to do, to tell you what the so what is. And she's laughing at me back there at her table. First of all, the so what is that theistic evolution is highly denigrative of the Word of God. As you can see, it slices across numerous necessary doctrines of the Christian faith. And secondly, the whole process of evolution, theistic evolution scientifically is unnecessary. As I tried to show you, the process of evolution doesn't work. There is no evidence for universal common ancestry. There's no scientific reason to adopt a view of theistic evolution. But literally, thousands have. And if you send any of your sons and daughters off to a Christian college, expect that the biology department will be filled with theistic evolutionists. I've given up trying to talk to theistic evolutionists. I've tried in the past. But what I found out is that they went through a crisis somewhere in their college years, either as an undergrad or a graduate student. They were believers, but they were seeing from their professor's perspective that this evolution thing was a slam dunk. And I've got to find a way to hold on to my Christian faith and my attraction to biological science in particular. And so it was a long, fought-out struggle, and they finally came to this conclusion of theistic evolution. So as a Christian, they could still teach Sunday school to the local church, and when they were at their university, they had no problems with the other faculty either. And they don't want to go through that again. They absolutely will not talk about it. So beware, if you visit a Christian college to send one of your kids to, visit the biology department, please, and ask about this question. Christian colleges and universities don't invite me to speak there. I don't share their view. So I can cause problems with their students. Okay, now the last part here is, what about the origin of evil? What theistic evolutionists have to accept is that God did not create an originally very good natural world. Evolutionary philosopher David Hull said, the God implied by evolutionary theory is not a loving God who cares about his productions. He is careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical. Not the sort of God whom anyone would be inclined to pray. So, Hull just rejects God altogether. But theistic evolutionists have a real problem here. One theistic evolutionist settles for the underwhelming notion of a pelican heaven, symbolizing the hope that everything will be fine in the end. Another says that God created a tough world. It seems they have to shrug their shoulders and stop worrying. That sound like a reasonable conclusion to you? How do we deal with evil? Well, yeah, God, what they're seeing is God had to be responsible, at least for natural evil. So how do I, as a Christian, deal with that? It's not because of human sin. It's because of God. This is called theodicy. How does God explain the existence of evil? Well, the Bible explains it, but not like this. One last thing here is that Pam Bailey here with Discovery Institute, there will be a Dallas conference on science and faith, February 26th. 28th? Oh, 20, yeah. February 28th, 2026. Where's it going to be at, Pam? Park Cities Baptist, so it'll be in Dallas. February 28th will be my wife's birthday. I'm not going to tell you what birthday it is. I'm a little bit smarter than that. So, Ben Carson, Michael Legnor, some of you heard him before, Stephen Meyer, Nancy Piercy. You got to come hear Nancy Piercy. Stuart Burgess, another one you really need to hear. So, hope you can come. And that's all I got.